first reading today is from Deuteronomy chapter 15, first verses 1 through 2. Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Continuing with the 7th verse, if there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and therefore view your needy neighbor with hostility and give nothing. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and be ungrudging when you do so. For on this account the Lord your God will bless you in your work and in all that you undertake, since there will never cease to be some need on the earth. I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and the needy neighbor in your land. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
This morning's gospel reading is taken from the book of Luke, the 15th chapter, verses 11 through 32. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, You are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Grace and peace to you in the name of the living Christ. Hello, St. Luke's, and happy anniversary. It is a joy and a privilege to be back in my home church and to see so many familiar faces. This is the place where I was baptized, confirmed, and married, and all three stuck. I came here for preschool with Mrs. Johnson, who was at the first service, and Mrs. Carpenter. This community was integral in forming my faith, encouraging me to ask questions, and giving me opportunities to be a leader in the church. One of my oldest memories was when I was a young girl sitting in the pew alongside my parents. I'm glad you saved my mother's pew for her this morning. That was nice after all these years. And we always sat up front so she could hear better and read lips. Now, in this memory, I must have been 7 years old or maybe a little younger. And the children's choir came up to the chancel to sing. I was mesmerized, thinking that is where I want to be. I want to be in front of the church. Now, it would have been a lot better for the choir if I actually had a good singing voice, but I was welcomed nonetheless. I was part of the choir, part of the church, and I knew I belonged. There were other opportunities that followed. I taught Sunday school and played my clarinet while I still had braces on my teeth. I led worship alongside the first woman pastor, Marcia Thompson. And I was given the opportunity to direct the youth choir on tour while Maureen Armstrong stayed home with her children. St. Luke's, you have been very, very good to me. Now fast forward to June 19th, 2021, when I was ordained and became a minister of word and sacrament, which is just fancy language for becoming a pastor. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the church where I am currently serving. You see, when a pastor is up for a call, they are first assigned into a synod. St. Luke's is in the Minneapolis Synod, which includes Minneapolis and its suburbs. I was assigned to the St. Paul Synod, which includes St. Paul and its suburbs. So I thought I might be assigned to a church in the Como Park neighborhood, maybe Vadnais Heights or even White Bear Lake. Nope. They sent me to a little church about an hour north of St. Paul in a city called Stark. The town is literally named Stark. It has 2 buildings, and we both serve alcohol. There it is. In my very first month as a pastor, the septic tank leaked into the alfalfa field. Now, I'm a Bloomington girl, home to the Mall of America. Not once did I have a class in seminary that taught me about septic tanks or alfalfa. I was out of my element, out of my league, and so full of self-doubt that I had no idea why God called me to be their pastor. But just like my experience here at St. Luke's, my new church embraced me and made me feel at home, even though I still don't know much about alfalfa and I still can't sing. Let me just inject here that Fish Lake Lutheran is the most beautiful church, nestled into the countryside, surrounded by a cemetery, tall oaks, and alfalfa. I encourage you all to visit. They have beautiful people. Now back to business. Pastor Rob has been leading you through a 3-week exploration of Sabbath. On his first week, he defined Sabbath as a time of rest and divine work. I'd like to build on his teachings by defining Sabbath as a time of homecoming and healing. In our gospel text today from the book of Luke, we visit the parable commonly called the prodigal son. And in this parable, the younger of 2 sons asks for his share of the property so that he can live it up in a distant country. After he had spent everything, he finds himself living in squalor and dying of hunger. He remembers his father and decides to return home, asking for forgiveness. Now, there must be 2 truths for the man to make this decision. First, he has to have hope. He has to have hope that his father will take him back. Secondly, the man has to believe that he deserves a second chance, that he will be welcomed, forgiven, embraced, that he will be given Sabbath. Imagine with me for a moment that Sabbath is not just a time of rest, but a time of release. It's a release of anything that binds us, bogs us down, or stops us from being the beautiful creation God intends for us to be. That is also Sabbath. And that is the world in which God calls us to create. Our reading from Deuteronomy says, every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts. It's a reference to the Jewish practice of Jubilee, set out in the book of Leviticus, in which every 7 years all debts are forgiven, all slaves are freed, and the land is allowed to go fallow. This is a generous and grace-filled act of restoring the world and starting again. And it's not easy. It takes vulnerability, courage, and ultimately strength. That younger brother needed to be vulnerable enough to confess the error of his ways. He needed the courage to ask his father for forgiveness, and he needed the strength to start again. The father needed to be vulnerable enough to trust the son again. He needed the courage to make a public display of his trust by throwing a party and inviting all the neighbors to the celebration. And he needed the strength to forgive. It's not easy. But thankfully, we have a God who gifts us Sabbath. The time, the space, and the grace needed for restoration and growth. At the heart of Sabbath practice is an encounter with the grace of God. Guilt, shame, and self-doubt are all things under which we labor. But there is hope, because Sabbath reminds us that we worship and follow a God who brings freedom. What we see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is freedom from sin, restoration with God, and a resetting of all creation. This is the heart of what it means to keep Sabbath. This is God's invitation. We have been invited into God's peace, whether we are the repentant younger brother, the forgiving father, or the older brother, one of my favorite Bible characters, who comes to the party dragged by his father, kicking and screaming. We all need Sabbath, the greatest homecoming of all. Amen.